The global scenario has just been shaken. Donald Trump, upon his return to the presidency of the United States, has just made a decision that could completely change the course of the war between Russia and Ukraine. Unexpectedly, Trump suspended the sending of air defense missiles to Ukraine and, at the same time, halted all new sanctions against Vladimir Putin and his allies. This change of stance completely broke with the policy adopted during the previous administration, led by Joe Biden, which had imposed a series of strict measures against Moscow. As soon as he returned to office, Trump made it clear that his government would follow a very different path. Not only did he freeze the sending of new sanctions, but he also began to dismantle some of the restrictions that were in place. One of the first signs was the lifting of sanctions against Russian banks involved in the construction of nuclear power plants, a decision that caused surprise and concern among international analysts. To understand the impact of this change, we need to look back at what had been happening up until then. During the Biden administration between 2022 and January 2025, the United States applied more than 6,200 sanctions against Russia. These measures affected a wide range of targets, including individuals, companies, and strategic sectors of the Russian economy, such as oil, weapons, technology, and the financial sector. Sanctions have become a true weapon of economic warfare. Biden applied, on average, 170 sanctions per month, a number that tripled in the final weeks of his administration. The objective was clear: to strangle the Russian economy and cut off Moscow's access to essential technologies and resources to sustain its military effort. However, with Trump's return, this scenario changed radically. With no new sanctions in place, a dangerous loophole has opened up. Intermediary companies, many based in Hong Kong and Singapore, have begun to operate heavily in the international market. They buy large quantities of electronic components under the pretext of using them in the production of civilian equipment. However, in practice, these components end up being diverted to Russia, where they directly feed the arms industry. One of the main items smuggled are the chips used in the Kh-101 cruise missiles, one of the most sophisticated in the Russian arsenal. These missiles require advanced technology, usually supplied by Western companies. Now, with the United States inertia, Moscow is managing to replenish its production lines. The consequences are clear. Russia has once again accelerated its military production. With the flow of components restored, Russian factories have increased the production of missiles, drones, and bombs, intensifying attacks on Ukrainian cities. The easing of sanctions has allowed Putin to rebuild his war machine, increasing the pressure on Kyiv. And Trump's actions did not stop there. One of the most controversial moves of his government was the removal of Karina Rodenberg from the list of sanctioned individuals. She is the wife of one of Putin's closest oligarchs and also holds American citizenship. Karina had been one of the first individuals to be sanctioned after the 2022 Russian invasion, but has now been quietly removed from the restricted lists. In addition, the Trump administration has disbanded the Klepto Capture Task Force, an operation created to locate and seize the assets of Russian oligarchs around the world. During the previous administration, the task force had managed to seize more than $700 million in assets, including yachts, mansions, and luxury jets. With its dissolution, dozens of Russian billionaires have regained access to their assets, further relieving Vladimir Putin's inner circle. With the easing of economic sanctions and the end of the task force that hunted down Russian assets, the Trump administration has not only removed restrictions, but also exempted Moscow from further trade penalties. In a surprising decision, the White House chose not to include Russia in the global tariffs imposed by Trump, which provide for a minimum surcharge of 10% on imports from virtually all countries in the world. This exclusion caught the attention of experts, who saw it as a clear sign of tolerance towards Vladimir Putin's regime. For many analysts, the fact that Russia was left out of the global tariffs suggests that the United States is willing to adopt a permissive stance in the face of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, something unthinkable just a few months ago. The message to the world was clear: Washington is no longer so interested in containing Moscow. With the weakening of U.S. actions, the responsibility for putting pressure on Russia fell to the European Union. The European bloc, which had already been applying sanctions since the beginning of the war, became the main protagonist on this front. However, Europe faces serious difficulties in reaching the networks of intermediaries operating outside of Russian territory. These companies, many located in Asian countries and the Middle East, continue to be essential to maintaining the flow of resources and equipment that supply the Russian war machine. Europe's ability to track and disrupt these operations is still limited, especially without the active support of the United States. Historically, Washington has always led global sanctions initiatives due to its economic power and international influence. Now, with the U.S. withdrawal, Europe's leading role is intensifying, but without the same impact. As the European Union tries to fill the vacuum left by Washington, the United States Congress is beginning to move. Senators from both parties, both Democrats and Republicans, have been pressuring the Trump administration to resume the offensive against Moscow. A new bill has been introduced, proposing severe measures, including tariffs of up to 500% on any country that still buys Russian energy. This proposal takes direct aim at China, India, and even Brazil, which is currently the second largest importer of Russian diesel in the world. If these sanctions are approved, Russia could lose one of its last and most valuable sources of income, which would represent a brutal blow to its already fragile economy. However, even with the progress in Congress, the implementation of these measures depends exclusively on a direct order from the president. And so far, Trump has shown himself reluctant to take any action that could harm Moscow. But perhaps the most significant blow to Ukraine came not from sanctions, but from the military realm. On July 1, 2025, the White House officially announced a temporary suspension of shipments of missiles, guided bombs, and artillery shells to Ukraine. Among the items suspended were Patriot air defense interceptors, which are essential for protecting Ukrainian cities from Russian missiles, as well as missiles used by F-16 fighter jets, which are essential for defending airspace. These weapons have been crucial in countering Russian attacks, which have intensified in recent weeks, causing widespread destruction in several Ukrainian cities. The Pentagon justified the decision by saying that the United States' own munition stockpiles are at dangerously low levels. The administration said it was necessary to preserve American military readiness to face other global threats, especially in the Middle East and in areas like Israel, where regional tensions remain high. Many of the suspended weapons were scheduled to be delivered in the coming months, and the suspension could signal something even more worrying: the beginning of a gradual withdrawal of the United States as Ukraine's main arms supplier. Such a move, if confirmed, would have a devastating impact on Ukrainian morale and the balance of forces on the battlefield. The decision has sparked strong reactions both inside and outside the United States. Several members of Congress, from both parties, have harshly criticized the White House, accusing the Trump administration of compromising Ukraine's security at a critical time. For these critics, the signal that Washington has sent to the world is one of weakness and weariness regarding the conflict. By suspending essential weapons deliveries, Trump has, intentionally or not, given a strategic gift to Vladimir Putin, who may now see an opportunity to further extend his brutal attacks on the Ukrainian people, with less resistance from the West. While Ukraine is facing the suspension of its weapons and the easing of sanctions, the diplomatic scenario in Washington has also changed radically. In the early years of the war, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky was treated as a hero in the U.S. Congress, received with enthusiasm and tributes. At that time, Biden promised unrestricted support for Ukraine, guaranteeing aid for as long as necessary. But today, this scenario has completely undone. Zelensky, once exalted, now faces a hostile climate. He was recently received coldly and even expelled from the White House by Trump, in an episode that laid bare the United States' new position in the conflict. Trump even accused Zelensky of putting the world at risk by insisting on resistance against Russia, insinuating that the Ukrainian government was pushing the planet towards a possible Third World War. Since Trump returned to power, no new military aid package to Ukraine has been proposed. The country, which previously relied on American support as a fundamental pillar for its defense, now finds itself isolated, with its main ally retreating and Europe lacking the full capacity to assume the same role. The current situation clearly points to an increasingly vulnerable Ukraine and a visibly strengthened Russia. In addition to regaining access to vital components for its military industry, Moscow is under much less financial, political, and economic pressure from the United States. Meanwhile, The U.S. Congress continues to debate new sanctions bills, trying to find ways to reverse the situation, but is encountering resistance from the Trump administration itself, which remains inflexible. Analysts warn that the U.S. withdrawal could have devastating consequences not only for Ukraine, but for the world order as a whole. If U.S. support for Ukraine disappears definitively, this will open the way for Russia to further expand its influence, not only in Eastern Europe, but also in other strategic regions of the world. Countries that currently depend on American protection may begin to question the reliability of the United States as an ally, which could reconfigure geopolitical alliances on a global scale. The Russian advance, facilitated by American inertia, could mark the beginning of a new era in international relations, in which economic sanctions cease to be an effective weapon and the use of military force once again dictates the rules of the game. Washington's silence and the suspension of strategic weapons dramatically weaken Ukraine's position. For many, what is underway is not just a temporary shift in American foreign policy, but a historic turnaround, the impact of which will be felt for decades. Given this scenario of uncertainty, the big question remains: how far is Trump willing to back down? And, more importantly, what will be the concrete consequences of this withdrawal for global security? Experts warn that simply suspending missiles and freezing sanctions are enough to change the balance of power in the conflict, directly favoring Russia. Without new weapons and without economic pressure, Moscow has free rein to intensify its military operations, while Ukraine finds itself cornered, fighting practically alone. The combination of diplomatic isolation, resource cuts, and the suspension of military supplies paints a bleak future for Kyiv and for all of Eastern Europe. Over time, the American withdrawal could not only seal Ukraine's fate, but also redefine the United States' position in the world, leading to a new era of instability, competition between great powers, and regional conflicts without diplomatic solutions. Suspension of missiles and sanctions. Trump suspended the shipment of air defense missiles to Ukraine and halted new sanctions against Russia, favoring Moscow in the war. 23 End of sanctions. Under Trump. Since resuming the presidency, Trump has not applied new sanctions against Russia and has even revoked some, such as restrictions on Russian banks involved in nuclear projects. 47 Contrast with Biden. Under Biden, the U.S. applied more than 6,200 sanctions to Russia between 2022 and January 2025, focusing on strategic sectors such as oil, technology, and finance. 118 Increase in smuggling. The absence of new sanctions has allowed the proliferation of intermediary companies, mainly in Hong Kong and Singapore, which send electronic components for Russian weapons, such as KH-101 missiles. 218 American inertia and Russian strengthening. With U.S. inertia, Russia strengthens its military production and gains an advantage in the conflict, increasing its attacks on Ukraine. 245 Relaxation of personal sanctions and closure of operations. Trump removed Karina Rodenberg from the sanctions list and ended the task force that seized assets from Russian oligarchs. 332 Russia spared from global tariffs. Trump's new import tariffs did not include Russia, which many analysts see as a permissive stance by the U.S. in the face of the invasion. 40 Europe takes the lead in sanctions. With the U.S. retreat, the European Union leads the sanctions, but has difficulty containing networks of intermediaries that supply Russia. 532 Suspension of weapons to Ukraine. In July 2025, Trump temporarily suspended the shipment of crucial weapons for Ukrainian air defense, justifying the decision by the low availability in American stockpiles. 634 Isolated Ukraine and strengthened Russia. American military support for Ukraine has weakened. Congress is pushing for new measures, but the Trump administration resists, leaving Ukraine increasingly vulnerable and Russia even stronger.